Hey everyone, this is your Working People host, Maximilian Alvarez.
Hey, this is Ju-Hyun Park, back at it again.
All right, gang. So we got a real treat for y'all on the main feed today. So if you are a Patreon subscriber and supporter of Working People, first of all, thank you so much. It's because of you guys that we are able to produce this show every week. And we try to keep y'all stocked with really great and rich and interesting bonus episodes every month over on the Patreon feed. So if you aren't a Patreon supporter, please do support us and you'll get access to all of our great bonus episodes that we're publishing every month over there on Patreon. And we actually published a really killer bonus episode back in March, which was a conversation between Ju-Hyun and myself. I have the honor of working with Ju-Hyun at the Real News Network, but they are also, an accomplished and fiercely dedicated activist, organizer, thinker. And I brought them on the show in March to sort of talk about an area that we haven't talked about nearly enough on this show, which was, the state of organized labor in Korea and how labor and the labor movement fits into the larger picture of the fight for reunification on the Korean Peninsula. And Ju-Hyun, to their credit, dealt with my very big questions and answered them as rigorously as they possibly could. But we wanted to share this great conversation that Ju-Hyun and I had with our listeners here on the public feed. And to commemorate that occasion, we thought it would be nice to sort of check in real quick and give you guys a bit of an update on what's been going on over in Korea since we published that episode back in March. So I guess, Ju-Hyun, once again, I'm putting you on the spot. What's been going on over in Korea in the past few months?
Yeah, so since March, we have definitely seen an escalation in the labor struggle in South Korea in lots of different ways. So when we checked in last, we were talking a little bit about the trucker strike, which occurred last fall and winter. We spoke a little bit about the history of the labor movement and its role in the political struggle against the Yoon Suk-yeol administration, who is the current president of South Korea. To catch us up a little bit, I think the biggest episode that we need to focus on, for starters, is the death of Yang Hae-dong, who was a chapter leader of the National Construction Workers Union. He set himself on fire on May Day in protest of racketeering charges that he was placed under, along with several other union leaders at the time. Now, this is part of President Yoon's so-called war on unions, which he is prosecuting, mainly targeting them under, I guess, the best sort of analogy to US law would be kind of thinking about the RICO Act and things like that. So basically the charge is that the unions are corrupt, that, they are infiltrated with gangsters at the most, abhorrent rhetoric. They'll use the language of North Korean spies and things of that nature. But they've really been taking, this corruption angle against the unions in particular. And, the self-immolation that Yang Hae-dong did, the setting himself on fire was in protest of all of these charges and, the general campaign that's being waged against union leaders, because of course, these are incredibly trumped up charges and their purpose is primarily political, right? It's to intimidate the union leadership. It is to restrict their capacity to organize. And it's also an attempt to kind of spoil public opinion away from the union leadership and also give the impression that the union administration is doing something to rein in the strikes and labor activity, which can be disruptive to society, because that is precisely the point. But I think it's worth pointing out that all of that is happening amidst a huge downturn in the South Korean economy, which has seen really a record trend of over a year of month after month of trade imbalances, of declining power of the won or the Korean currency. And a lot of that is tied to the Yoon administration's foreign policy, specifically to his sort of obsequience to Washington, and his going along with the United States dictums that South Korea and other nations in the Asia Pacific, such as Japan, Taiwan, others, should essentially be cutting off their economic ties with China, which by this point is, the economic powerhouse of the region and, a major trading partner with all of these countries. So these countries cannot go along with the U.S. plan to isolate them from China without taking a major economic hit. And I think, it's important to situate Yoon's war on the labor unions within all of that as, part of his attempt to gain political points despite making some very bad political moves, at least from the perspective of what is good for South Korea's economy. Now, getting back to this incident, there's been a huge uproar, particularly in the labor sector, against the Yoon administration, against the prosecution of union leaders as a result of the death of Yang Hae-dong. The workers in the Korean Construction Workers Union have taken the initiative to stage a series of extended rallies and candlelight vigils at City Hall that have lasted for weeks and months. There is a video from the Real News regarding that story, which I definitely recommend that people check out. And this has really been used as a moment to galvanize the entire labor movement, to also bring other sectors into this political struggle against the Yoon administration. We've also seen a lot of stellar and very militant labor activity, particularly from the metal workers union. And that's spurred a lot of repression from the Yoon government, including with some very widely circulated, at least in Korean media, videos of police officers taking down union leaders, including going as far as to there was an incident where metal workers unions occupied a construction site, and then so the police got on a crane to physically beat the union workers who were occupying that high place. So these are just some examples of small episodes that sort of illustrate the way that the labor movement is the labor struggle is intensifying, and the way that the militancy of the workers is on display, and they are standing firm against the many kinds of repression that are coming at them, whether it's physical or legal. Now, I could go sector by sector, talk union by union. I think that would result in a very long update, but I think to fast forward a little bit into what's been happening in the past few weeks, we've been seeing how there's a real coalescing occurring in order to kind of bring labor more full frontally into this political struggle against the Yoon administration, often under the banner of the slogan of demanding resignation of the current president. And that's something that's been called for through many sectors of South Korean society, particularly following the widely internationally recognized incident last Halloween in the district of Itaewon, where hundreds of people died in a crowd-crushing incident. And it was later revealed that police were not responding to calls made by partygoers hours ahead of time, pointing out that the situation there was very dangerous, because they had been diverted to guard the president's office, which had been moved from its traditional place in the government house known as the Blue House to a kind of to a location that's very close to the U.S. military base in the same neighborhood. So there's been many calls for Yoon's resignation, and labor is now kind of has already been involved in that struggle, but has been coming out more in full force. And we've been seeing that in the past few weeks. At the end of June, there was an 80,000 strong mobilization, particularly of precarious workers in the capital who were demanding a raise to the minimum wage. The South Korean minimum wage is about 9,600 won or something like that, which, because of the fluctuating exchange rate, particularly over the past year, and the devaluing of the currency, really means that workers have been seeing a loss in real wages, which you have to also pair with the fact that South Korea, like many other countries, is seeing record inflation. Now, in addition to that, in the last couple of weeks, we've actually seen a general strike in South Korea, led by the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, which is the umbrella union that includes the Construction Workers Union, the Metal Workers Union. And
that's the federation whose offices were raided in January by the same government.
Yes, exactly. And so in this general strike, we saw about 250,000 people participate in the strike itself, over 100,000 people participating in over 30 street actions and demonstrations. And once again, it's all kind of there are, of course, like economic demands folded into it that are specific to sectors. We did see the medical health workers union participate in whole in this general strike. So that's tens of thousands of hospital workers and healthcare workers with their own specific demands. But we also see it rising to the level of political demands, not only including questions around regulations and protections for workers as a whole, but also the minimum wage, but also around this question of the resignation of the current president. So I think that's probably the most concise update that can be offered in terms of what has been unfolding in the last few months with the South Korean labor movement. And if we go by the reporting of the union itself, we are seeing a turn in public opinion regarding union activity. Last fall and winter, there was some public opposition to the activities of the trucker strike. And I think, the union administration was also able to successfully leverage its crackdown against them to see a short bump in their approval ratings. But, going by, the most current polls, public opinion is shifting towards the side of the unions against the union administration, and, is becoming more and more supportive of labor action. So I think these are definitely positive developments. Of course, we have to wait and see in terms of how this is all going to play out. And in the meantime, there are a bunch of military escalations also occurring in Korea that are not unrelated to the struggle that we're seeing in the streets.
Hell yeah. Well, I mean, this is an intense and important story that we are going to do our best to continue covering. Ju-Hyun themselves is actually getting ready to go to South Korea as well. So when they return, I promise we will have them back on to debrief and kind of get an update on the state of things over there in South Korea. But as they mentioned, like, you cannot tell this story of the government repression of and crackdown on organized labor in South Korea without talking about the kind of increased military activity, the sort of imperialist jockeying for position between the U.S., attempts to encircle China, to isolate other countries in the region from China. As Ju-Hyun already mentioned, like, this translates to real hurt for working people, right? And there are a lot of dimensions to that, but I really hope that everyone listening to this in North America understands that, this isn't just empty rhetoric coming from U.S. politicians. These are actual policies. This is actual foreign policy that is translating to continued immiseration for poor and working people, and is giving a license to a reactionary government to crack down on organized labor. So we all need to be invested in this struggle. And in fact, that's a perfect lead into the bonus episode that we're going to now play for y'all, because Ju-Hyun did an incredible job in that episode of explaining how the sort of military imperialist side of this, from North Korea, China, the U.S., all the kind of big questions about foreign policy and military and economic hegemony connect to the question of labor and worker struggles. So I guess without further ado, we will circle back with Ju-Hyun when they return from South Korea. So let's all send our love and solidarity to them and wish them well and stay safe over there, comrade. And when you get back, I am going to force you to come back on the show and talk about what you saw and what you heard. But thank you so much for coming back on, Ju-Hyun. Thank you for laying this out. And we'll talk to you when you get back.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for having me back on, Max. Hi everyone, my name is Ju-Hyun Park. I am the engagement editor here at The Real News. I'm also a member of Noruto for Korean Community Development, which is an organization of Koreans and our comrades struggling against imperialism in Korea and for national reunification. Thanks for having me on, Max.
All right. Well, welcome everyone to another special bonus episode of Working People, a podcast about the lives, jobs, dreams, and struggles of the working class today. Brought to you in partnership with In These Times magazine and the Real News Network, produced by Jules Taylor and made possible by the support of beautiful listeners and Patreon subscribers like you. So as y'all heard, we've got a really special guest with us today, my comrade and now colleague, Ju-Hyun Park, who is, as they mentioned, the engagement editor at the Real News Network. We get to work together every day. They do incredible work as an activist, as an engagement editor, and as a journalist. And in fact, that's how I came to in contact with Ju-Hyun's work. Because back in October of 2021, so Jesus, I guess it was like a year and a half ago, at the Real News, I remember seeing a piece, a text article that the great outlet Truth Out had published about, 500,000 South Korean workers getting ready to walk off the job in a general strike. And I was like, whoa, I haven't heard shit about this. So I read the piece. It was great. And it was a piece that Ju-Hyun co-authored with Jia-Hong. And we were able to republish it at the Real News, and it took off because no one else was hearing about it either. And I mean, this was a really, really kind of crucial moment, right? And that's kind of where we're going to talk. That's what we're going to talk about for y'all today, because, a lot has been going on in the labor movement and beyond over in South Korea. And, I thought like it would be really important to just sort of like give listeners as much kind of context as we can in a short time on a bonus episode. I know that Ju-Hyun's so knowledgeable about this that we could have like a 5-hour podcast, but I'm not going to do that to them. We're just going to do like a close to a 1-hour podcast here. But I know that, folks who listen to the show have been, if not seeing the news in the past couple years about this kind of labor unrest in South Korea. I damn sure know that a lot of our followers saw the news earlier this year, 2023, when South Korea's intelligence agency raided the offices of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions in January. And, like this is like, a really, really kind of dark situation where, it seems like this new president is very explicitly kind of like pushing through this anti-labor politics, right? And so I wanted to sort of like bring Ju-Hyun on to just get folks like some up-to-date info and essential context. And we're going to try to kind of basically like walk you through these 2 points in time, right? From that, general strike that occurred in October of 2021 to these, raids on organized labor headquarters in January of 2023. And before I toss things back to Ju-Hyun, I just wanted to read a little passage from that piece in Truth Out, which we republished a year and a half ago, because I think it really grounds us. And we're gonna link to it in the show notes so y'all can read the full thing. But here's what Ju-Hyun and Jia-Hong wrote in that piece. And again, this was from October of 2021. Quote, "Today, South Korea ranks third in highest annual working hours. And as of 2015, it was third in workplace deaths among member countries of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD. Over 40% of all workers are considered irregular workers. As in the United States, many of these irregular workers labor in the gig economy, beholden to the tech giants' apps. With an economy and society dominated by corporate conglomerates known as, Ju-Hyun, how do I pronounce this? Is it chaebol?
Yeah.
Corporate conglomerates known as chaebol. South Korean people face increasingly bleak prospects. The top 10% of earners claimed 45% of total income in 2016. Real estate speculation has led to a housing crisis, and privatization in education and healthcare are expanding disparities. As South Korea undergoes blowback from the effects of COVID-19 on the global economy, these crises have only sharpened. Exploitation and unsafe conditions are consistent across industries. Coal miners at Korea Coal, a government-owned coal mining corporation, are suffering health conditions from breathing in coal dust and overwork. One coal miner recounted the plight of irregular workers, saying, quote, "The government reduced the labor force by half, so our unit now has to do the job of 2 units. So everyone is ill. There's no one here who is not sick. Our wages need to increase but have stayed the same. We work the same as regular workers, but we don't even get half the pay," end quote. So sadly, as anyone who listens to this show knows, you'll hear a lot of striking echoes of the things that workers here in the U.S. and the folks that we've spoken to in the U.K. and France. I mean, we're hearing, sadly, a lot of the same issues that working people are facing across the globe. So that's kind of like the essential sort of like table setting that I wanted to do here. And again, we're going to link to that great piece from October 2021. And we're also going to link to a great piece in Labor Notes by Cap Soul about the intelligence raids on the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions. So you guys can read up on that after listening to this episode. But enough from me. Ju-Hyun, I want to kind of toss it over to you. And again, I don't want to make you write a whole dissertation here. I know that there are a lot of folks that listen to this show who probably know next to nothing about kind of the situation of organized labor, let alone regular working people in South Korea. So I wanted to ask if you could just sort of talk to us as you would a child, right? Like starting with the general strike in October 2021. What essential context do people need to have about where this worker unrest is coming from, what workers in South Korea are going through, and then like how we got from there to these, draconian raids of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions earlier this year?
Thanks, Max. So, yeah, this is a pretty extensive historical breadth that we need to cover. Even though it's only been a year and a half, there are many, many different details and factors that we could dive into. I'm going to do my best to keep it at the surface level, to keep it at the most important information possible, which may mean that at times I don't really go into detail about some factors, but I'll still do my best to try to present as cohesive of a narrative as I can. So, as you laid out with the quote from the piece that I wrote a couple years back with my comrade Chia Hong, there is a crisis that has been ongoing within South Korea, not only since 2 years ago, but really since the 1997 IMF crisis, which is when South Korea was forced to accept IMF loans, along with many other strings attached as IMF loans usually come with, which included changes to its labor laws that have really reworked the economic structure of the country in some fundamental ways. And I would argue that for a very large strata of South Korea's working class, there has never really been a recovery since this period. The figure that you stated around the number of so-called irregular workers, those are workers that are working without an official contract who are not covered under existing labor laws, that's their proportion of the workforce has been steadily rising since the 2000s and has been at the level of being about half of the workforce for, I think it's safe to say, roughly a decade, if not more. So this is something that has been building in South Korea for a long, long time. It didn't just appear with this general strike a couple of years back. The thing that I would point out around the timing of the general strike in October 2021 was that it was really supposed to influence the upcoming presidential elections in May of last year, in 2022. And the purpose of the strategy of the KCTU, the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, was to bring together the most marginalized and oppressed strata of the working masses. So that includes the irregular workers, it includes the remaining peasantry in South Korea, it includes organizations for the urban poor, as well as with the more traditional unions for workers who, are considered so-called regular workers, workers who have contracts, who still have some protections under the law. And the purpose of this was to really shake things up and to bring together a working coalition that could push for major changes in South Korea at the time. Something that's important to understand is that South Korea in 2021 was under the administration of a liberal president known as Moon Jae-in. Moon Jae-in is best known to the world for his efforts to move forward Korean reunification. There were many progressive things that he did on that front, including the signing of the Panmunjom Declaration in 2018, which created something like a roadmap for an eventual process of reunification with North Korea or the DPRK, and also announced the shared intent of both governments to end the Korean War, which till this day has not been formally concluded by a peace treaty. Now, I bring this up because while Moon Jae-in was progressive in some of these ways, he was ultimately still a representative of the capitalist class. He was brought to power by the Candlelight Revolution in 2016, which deposed former President Park Geun-hye. But he was not he did not come in necessarily as a representative of that movement. The movement did successfully remove the existing president, but it did not bring about a transition of power that was under the control of the movement itself, is what I'm trying to say. So he came in as a representative of the existing political establishment, a representative of existing neoliberalism, sort of the left wing of neoliberalism in South Korea, as in many other countries around the world, particularly in capitalist nations. If there are two parties or some kind of rivalry between political parties, it's often between different strains of what sort of neoliberalism that country will be adopting. And the same is true currently in South Korea as well. So under Moon Jae-in, the actual material circumstances of the vast majority of people did not improve. And with the particular historical circumstances of COVID-19, we can definitely say that they worsened, in fact. So what this all led to was last May in 2022, there was a bit of an upset victory by a new candidate from the right known as Yoon Suk-yeol. He was actually Moon Jae-in's former prosecutor, who helped prosecute the past administration, but then he switched allegiances to the right-wing party and then began to really push a campaign that was based on a couple of different points. There was a very strong current of anti-China rhetoric, anti-DPRK rhetoric. He very viciously attacked the diplomatic efforts of Moon Jae-in. And additionally, he promised that he would reduce taxes and improve the improve the environment for business, and in that process, sort of achieve some sort of trickle down improvement in conditions for the working class. Now, Yoon Suk-yeol won by less than 1% of the vote. I do want to point that out. This is not a president with a very clear mandate, but once he was in office, he really set about carrying out a lot of the things that he said he would, which included a much more aggressive stance towards both China and North Korea, and a much more pro-US and compliant stance with regard to the US's efforts to build a stronger military alliance in East Asia that is specifically aimed against China and North Korea. And this has included increased collaboration with Japan. Now, I realize that we're going a little bit all over the place here. We're talking on the one hand about labor conditions in South Korea, about the material circumstances facing workers, and then on the other hand, we're talking a lot about all these foreign policy items. And I think that it's essential to do this because I will argue that these two currents are actually very, very closely related. Now, the point that I want to kind of fast forward through is that 2022 was a very, very tense year on the Korean Peninsula. The DPRK, or North Korea, launched a record number of rockets and other ballistic missiles. There were also a record number of South Korean and U.S. joint military exercises, which are extremely provocative to the situation on the peninsula, and definitely not an exercise that promotes any kind of peace or dialogue, but really just sharpens the existing divisions and brings us closer to a situation of war. And in the face of this, it was actually the KCTU
and a lot of the workers' movements that posed a lot of the political opposition to this kind of military brinksmanship. On August 15th, there was a start of a major exercise known as the Ulji Freedom Shield exercises between the United States and South Korea. And the opposition in the streets was coming from the organized labor movement, which even went as far as to release a joint statement with the Organization of Trade Unions in the DPRK or North Korea itself. So this was a united statement from organizations of workers' unions across the peninsula opposing the drive towards a renewed war, opposing Yoon Suk-yeol's anti-people, anti-democratic policies.
And that statement, like, that's a pretty big fucking deal, right?
It's a huge deal. I think that's entirely appropriate to say. One thing that's very crucial, particularly when we get to talking about these raids, is that in South Korea, there is still what is known as the National Security Law, which dates back to from before the Korean War. And what this law does is that it defines any support for North Korea or the DPRK, which it defines as a quote-unquote anti-state entity, to be illegal activities. So any quote-unquote anti-state activities, any kind of support for the DPRK or even just communism, depending on which administration is in power, is interpreted as essentially an act of treason and can result in prosecution and charges that can and have sent many, many people to prison for years on end. So this is a very bold move that was taken by the organized labor movement to oppose the enhanced military drills on the peninsula and to oppose the war agenda of Yoon Suk-yeol and President Biden. Now, coming back to a little bit closer to the present day, as you mentioned, in January, there were raids on KCTU offices. There were also a number of arrests made in various peace groups, including the June 15th Committee, which is an organization that exists in both the North and South, as well as amongst overseas Koreans, which organizes for reunification, and arrests of members of the Korean Peasants League as well. And a lot of these charges came back to prosecution under the national security law. Many of these arrests of people were basically on the pretext that there was some sort of evidence that they had been spying for North Korea. Now, I think that that's important because the labor movement has been providing the main organized political opposition to Yoon Suk-yeol's administration throughout his presidency thus far. At the same time, they have not only been organizing within labor for economic concerns, but really pushing political demands as well. Political demands that don't just stop at the level of so-called domestic policy, but actually extend to international concerns as well. And so I think there's a couple of things happening here. I think Yoon Suk-yeol is going after these unions in this way, is ramping up charges, which I personally believe are fabricated, around so-called espionage conducted by members of the union movement and peace groups in an effort to really undermine their basis within society, in an effort to red bait the leaders of the organized workers movement, and really to do what so many right-wing leaders of South Korea have done before, which is to use the specter of the DPRK to crush the labor movement, to say that all those who fight for improved working conditions, who try to unionize their workplaces, who try to stand up to the bosses, must not only be communists, but also be traitors because they are operating for this so-called anti-state entity known as the other government of Korea. And I think this really speaks to how in South Korea, the question of the labor movement and justice for workers is very closely intertwined with the question of reunification, because so long as the war continues, so long as division continues, the capitalist class has this cudgel that they can use against workers at any time. That they're not only being disruptive, that they're not only simply being troublemakers, but that in fact that they are traitors who deserve to be treated and prosecuted as such. So I think that's about the shortest sort of summary that I can offer in terms of what's been going on.
Hey, I was going to say, you got minutes to spare. I thought that was beautifully done. Again, I know it probably pained you to gloss over, some details, but for me, that was incredibly helpful, and I know it will be for our listeners as well. And I want to I want us to end on that question of reunification and like the incredibly volatile state of things right now. But I guess before we get there, I wanted to just kind of really drill down on how you frame that analysis, because I think it's really important, and it really, I think, is an object lesson for all of us here in the West, right? And you know, I think it's safe to say that a lot of folks who are invested in the labor movement here in the U.S. or are part of that movement almost sort of see it as, yeah, somehow magically unconnected to the kind of tangled mess of geopolitics and international relations, whatever other terms like we give for it, right? But it feels like a terrain of struggle that we can actually like wrap our heads around and actually do something about. Whereas, you know, the kind of imperialist war machine from, you know, the things that are going on from the war in Ukraine to the Korean Peninsula, like for most people, they're just like, I don't know enough to know what I should feel about this or what's the right path. So like, I think there's this kind of knee-jerk sort of tendency to focus on what's in front of us, focus on the things that we can understand, including kind of the labor politics here in the U.S. What I would say to anyone who thinks that way, as I thought, you know, for many, many years of my life, is like, even today, the labor conditions that so many workers labor under, that we talk about every week on this show, the labor laws that we talk about all the time on this show, when we're talking about how incredibly fucking hard it is in the U.S. to unionize a non-union shop, all the different kind of stages you have to clear, all the ways that labor law is stacked in favor of the bosses. You know, not just in a unionization campaign, but when it comes to things like retaliation, right? I mean, there are so many laws that put workers at a disadvantage because the system moves so slowly. It can be exploited so easily by the bosses and the businesses that have the money, resources, and lawyers to do that, whereas workers generally do not. Right. So like from the working conditions to the labor laws to even the shape of the organized labor movement in the United States today, all of these have been directly shaped by anti-communist politics of the 20th century. Right. I mean, like, you guys, we've talked about it plenty on the show, but you can also go read about it. Right. You know, the mid-century, this was kind of the deal with the devil that the labor movement made, was like to excommunicate, to buy into the Red Scare, to excommunicate communists from the labor movement, even though those very same communists had been like recruited by the labor movement or into the labor movement years prior because they were the best organizers, right? They were more class conscious. They played a vital role in, you know, the growth of the labor movement around World War II. And then the inevitable crackdown on communism in this country because of the geopolitical situation, because of the anti-communist fervor in the capitalist West, the geopolitical war with the Soviet Union, but, you know, this really, really spanned the globe, the challenge that actually existing state socialism posed to the kind of capitalist hegemony, the emergent capitalist hegemony of the United States, so on and so forth. Like, all of this was directly translating to decisions that were made, legislation that was passed, people who were appointed to labor leader positions in labor unions, in legislatures, right? Certain people being picked for those positions over others, like plenty of people's lives being ruined for their affiliation or accused affiliation with the Communist Party. So that's just like one example of how you may think that like our labor struggle here is not connected to the crazy world of geopolitics. It is. It always has been. Like we always say here, it's not just like from a sense of worker solidarity because we are all working within and against this kind of global capitalist system. I think you can really hear that in, say, the international panel that we just posted a couple weeks ago with rail workers from the US, UK, and France. You can hear that in their stories. But also, like Ju-Hyun was describing, like there are also like very clear ways that you can look at the sort of influence that geopolitics and kind of the different rivalries and imperialist ends, or, you know, all of that stuff does impact what we do, how we work, how we organize, right? And I could go on. I mean, I got my my degrees in kind of Mexican radical history. Like the AFL was essentially like a quote unquote diplomacy arm of U.S. imperialism in Latin America. Like it was like it extended its tendrils out into Mexico and other parts of Latin America directly to counteract the influence of the Comintern in those same countries, right? So like, again, this is everywhere. But Ju-Hyun, I wanted to kind of bring you back in here before I talk too much on that front. I wanted to sort of like focus on that, like the sad like way that things have gone since the like over the past 20 years, right? You mentioned the IMF, you mentioned, right, this kind of, you know, economic restructuring that we hear about. And, you know, I remember another piece that we published at The Real News by Sam Yang last year that was like kind of a really deep analysis of the show Squid Games and trying to kind of put some analytical meat behind what this show that people were watching. And Sam really like talked about, he's like, what you need to understand is that the plot device of all these people being in debt, like that hits different for, you know, people in South Korea. Like, I guess could you talk a little more about, I guess, just like what working people in the 21st century, or the working class in South Korea in the 21st century, like what this kind of like crisis, this extended crisis has meant for their working and living conditions?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the place to start, as I mentioned before, is the real big condition is the casualization of labor. You know, this huge proportion of so-called irregular workers who are not protected by worker laws, who are not protected by contracts, and are really just at, you know, the disposable whims of their bosses. In the article in Truth Out, which you know, we've mentioned a couple times, Chia and I, my co-author, did talk about the role of tech giants and, you know, their platform apps, but it really is so much deeper than just the apps, right? And we're not just talking about Uber drivers. In many Korean workplaces, you go in and like there's actually workers working side by side, and some of them are on contracts and some of them are not, you know. So it's really not just concentration within particular industries or sectors. It's really a generalized condition that you find in many, many different workplaces. And, you know, the overall effect is to bring down the bargaining power of all workers, right? Because if, you know, some of your colleagues supposedly don't have a contract, supposedly are not covered by labor laws, what that means is that, you know, they're not supposed to be organizing with you. You can't really organize with them in the same way. The management is using different tactics to create these kind of segments of different kinds of workers in order to split the possibility of, you know, unified solidarity to fight for better conditions and, you know, also for the overthrow of the capitalist system, really. But, you know, there are some stats that I do want to share. So the top 10% of earners in South Korea in 2016 claimed 45% of the total income. As we mentioned before, there's been a runaway real estate and housing crisis that has been going on in South Korea. I think one thing to understand is that the way that rent laws work in South Korea, you actually don't pay your rent every month. You pay it in a lump sum, often to cover multiple years at a time. So what this means for most working people is they end up having to take out loans. So they end up going into debt in order to pay rent. And, you know, as you can imagine, this just creates this like really vicious cycle amongst workers. And I think I believe that the average household debt currently, or in the last couple of years, was almost double the annual income of a household.
Jesus.
Yeah, so you're really seeing a situation where most people, they're not financially solvent. Like most people are just in the red, and they're just constantly trying to like get as close back to even as possible. There's also a very stilted, uneven economy. We talk about these chaebol, these massive conglomerates. When I say this, I'm talking about your Samsungs, your LGs, like at this point, household names in many parts of the world. These conglomerates, 64 of them, account for 84% of the economic output, the GDP of all of South Korea, but only provide 10% of the jobs. So that means that about 90% of the economic pie is, on paper, only going to about 10% of the population. Of course, we understand that, people working those jobs are not the ones actually taking the lion's share of those profits, right? Those profits mainly go to the investor class, which is not just in South Korea itself, right? You have these big, billionaire oligarch kind of families, but then you also have all of the banks, all of the firms, mainly in the U.S., Japan, and Europe that are invested into these conglomerates as well. And so you have this situation where for the vast majority of people, they're employed in these secondary industries in these sectors of the economy that are really dependent upon these monopolies in order to exist, and that are therefore very much subject to the whims of the international market, to the ups and downs of global capitalism. And in the last couple of years, particularly with COVID, but also as a result of the Ukraine war and what that's meant, both in terms of Korea's prospects for trade and this global inflation crisis that we're seeing, most people are facing pretty bleak prospects. Things were not so great prior to the pandemic, but these compounding factors are really just putting a strain upon workers. And what that's meant in South Korea is an upswing in workers fighting back, right? There was the general strike in 2021. Last fall, there was a really well-publicized truckers' strike as well, which ultimately was repressed because the Yoon Suk-yeol government threatened the truckers with jail time. They threatened them with personal fines. They said you will individually be charged if you continue with this activity, if you continue with this strike. And I think that's also a factor into what we're seeing in this crackdown on the KCTU, using these spurious charges of having violated the national security law, of being North Korean spies. What they're really trying to do is enact really harsh labor discipline. They're trying to bring down the hammer so that they can keep the workers from being organized, so that they can keep these really brutal conditions running, because quite frankly, the system is eating itself. Like just as we're seeing around the world, the prospects for continued profits, continued growth in South Korea is just about as bad as it is anywhere else. And a lot of what the U.S. is doing to try to maneuver South Korea into its alliances is not helping the situation, because South Korea is ultimately a neighbor to Russia. It's a neighbor to China. It had, very important trade ties with these countries, and is increasingly facing pressure from the U.S. to, on the one hand, cut off those trade ties, and on the other, to export some of its major industries to the United States. So the prospects for even South Korea's capitalists under this imperialist arrangement are becoming increasingly poor, and so the response of the Yoon administration is to at least get a handle on the workers' movement so that they can keep the gears running for as long as possible. Of course, we know that it's they're really running up against the physical and political limits of this kind of system. And so this isn't a crisis that, the Yoon administration is going to be able to resolve, but this is the response that they're taking given all of these conditions coming together.
Man, yeah, it's like, I don't know. If you're a country out there, don't be friends with, I don't know what's worse, to be a friend or an enemy of the United States, because we fuck over both of them, Jesus. And like, so again, I want us to get to that before I have to let you go. But just like as one more quick kind of context filling question, and by no means do you have to kind of go into a whole thesis about this if you're uncomfortable. But it's just like, on the show, on our weekly episodes, people know the basic facts about the state of the organized labor movement in the United States. It's not great, as we know. There are, really important and vital signs of life. A lot of great new organizing happening. A lot of rank and file energy and reform efforts happening within existing unions. We're talking just after some pretty ground-shaking election results after the United Auto Workers, the UAW, held their first referendums, they held their first leadership elections after last year's referendum passed that would allow UAW membership and retirees to directly elect their international union leadership, which was not the case before. The Teamsters do that because the Teamsters were forced to do that after all the, organized crime and corruption scandals. This was actually like a government decree for the Teamsters to have more direct democracy in their union back in the 90s. So the UAW, as you guys know, we talked to Justin Mayhew, UAW member, auto worker in Kansas City a year or two ago. And we talked all about the importance of that referendum and now the elections that resulted after that referendum happened. And lo and behold, if you let the rank and file directly elect their leadership, maybe their choices will be different from the hand-picked successors of the people in that kind of union leadership class. So that's just one example of kind of the sort of general context that folks have for the conversations that we have with primarily U.S.-based workers here on the show. But we also know that, in general, union density in the United States is at a historic low point, barely hovering above 10%, dismal in the private sector. So that's the kind of context that I think people have on a week-to-week basis when they're hearing the stories of workers on this show. And so I just wanted to ask, again, in broader strokes, if you had any kind of additional points that you wanted to make, Ju-Hyun, about the state of organized labor in South Korea, or any particular nuances about that that folks should understand before we let you go?
Yeah, definitely. I think from the standpoint of the U.S., South Korean labor looks so organized, and that's because relatively it is much more organized.
Not hard.
I think that is a fact. And I think there are some real indicators that help us understand why that is. I think just on the surface, South Korea has umbrella union organizations. That's what the KCTU is. It's the second largest umbrella union organization. It's the more radical out of the 2 or 3 large umbrella organizations that exist. And the KCTU alone represents over 1 million workers. I don't really, actually, there may be something, there may be some kind of analogy to that within the U.S. labor movement. But I think that there's a difference in the level of politicization and the way that the KCTU has historically pushed for political demands, not just economic ones, throughout its history. A lot of that comes from the different histories of the labor movement, given the different histories of the two countries. South Korea was under authoritarian military fascist rule for roughly 40 years. These, of course, were regimes backed by the United States at the same time that it's saying, look at South Korea, it's the beacon of democracy against communist totalitarianism. But, the union movement, the labor movement really developed in tandem with the democratic movement in South Korea at the end of the 20th century, leading up to the moment of formal democratization in 1987. And then after that, it continued to expand. It continued to be a political force, pushing against the remnants of the past regimes that were still in government, that were still in power in many ways, and still really pulling the strings of the country's politics. So I think that is one of the major differences between the two. Because of these different historical trajectories, you end up with different kinds of labor movement, both in form in terms of how it's organized, and in terms of its essence, in the sense that these are very different than a lot of the larger kind of like union formations which may exist in the U.S. today, in that they have a very long history of involvement in not just economic or workplace struggles, but political struggles in things that cut across industries, and that really attempt to bring together the workers as a class to struggle for their interests. So I think that's one of the main differences that I would point out, which I don't know how much immediate lessons there are for folks involved in the union movement in the U.S. today from that. But I do think it's an important observation, because if unions are only ever concerned with what's going on in their shop floor or in their industry, without really seeking to build broad alliances that cut outside of that, then the scope of what unions are able to accomplish and the scale of power that they can build is always going to be limited. So I think that this is something very important for observers to know.
Yeah, no, I think that's beautifully put, and I'm heartened. I'm not heartened by much these days, but I am heartened by that. Right, when I hear and see folks, within the labor movement, really learning that essential lesson. Right, like, just off the top of my head, since we just recorded like our Working People live show in New York City a couple weeks back at the People's Forum, right? So you guys heard us talk to, this incredible panel of organizers, including Tov Sorov from Labor's Local 79, the construction workers union in New York City. And when people think of construction worker unions in New York City, right, as Tov says, the stereotype is, what is it, male, pale, and stale, right? That stereotypical, like, kind of 1970s, 80s New York construction worker. The negative connotations of that type of worker being that they feel that they're better than non-union workers. There is a kind of racist, sexist component. Women aren't welcome into that trade. Non-citizen workers are seen as like the enemy. So if you have like undocumented workers who are being exploited by anti-union contractors like Alba Demolition in the city, there was a time, and in fact there still are plenty of parts of the country now where union workers may see those undocumented hyper-exploited workers, or workers who are, coming back from prison and are having like their parole status like held hostage, which is why they have to work for these exploitative contractors, right? So really just the most exploitable groups of workers who in the past, were not the friends of, organized labor. They, a lot of union workforces didn't do anything to reach out to these groups. They in fact saw them as the enemy, the ones undercutting, their union jobs and so on and so forth. All the while, it's the bosses who are the ones who are fucking all of us over. It's the bosses who are exploiting people. It is the bosses who are finding ways to circumvent safety protocols and, steal wages, all that stuff. So it's very heartening to hear like a union like Labor's Local 79 learn those lessons from the past, and they are actually doing work to correct that, right? They are reaching out to non-union workers, to the most exploited workers in the construction industry in New York, which is a major component of the city's economy, right? And they are they're taking a kind of community organizing model that I think is kind of like at least embodying in some sense kind of those crucial lessons that Ju-Hyun articulated a second ago. I think the more of us who learn those lessons and put them into practice, the better. Right. And like, I guess that kind of leads us to the final turn here, right? About like how the Korean unification, right? If we're talking about expanding the scope and scale and solidarity of the working class, like we're literally talking about a country split down the middle, a people split down the middle, right? And how that split, has been used and weaponized in so many different ways to the detriment of working people on the Korean Peninsula. And like, I guess I know I only, Ju-Hyun, believe me, I know that this is like a topic for a whole other podcast, but I guess I just wanted to sort of like to ask again for the people who are listening to this here in the English speaking West, right? For folks who maybe just kind of, we've all been hyper conditioned living in the, imperialist core of the world. When we hear about this, we think, North Korea, bad, right? That's the evil one. That's the one that, the hermit kingdom that wants to be cut off, that, there must be some reasons for it. South Korea, good. They're more like us. Their economy's more like us, blah, 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 blah. Right. And this is the official, narrative that working people tend to get in this country. It's what I was fed my whole fucking life. And like, there are resonances all over the world of this kind of stuff. Like just right now, it's really dismal, but like people are seeing in real time, like, for the past year or so, we've been talking about, we gotta defend Ukraine at all costs, defend Ukraine at all costs. And it's like, yeah, Jesus, like the working people in Ukraine are like going through hell right now. And so naturally I know a lot of people who listen to the show, they're like, I want to help. I don't want people to go through this. And now here we are, you got actual legislators, you got lawmakers like Mitt Romney just saying the quiet part out loud where they're like, well, we don't actually want peace brokered between Russia, Ukraine, NATO, whatever. Like, we just want to basically keep pushing Ukrainians into the firing line so that it, quote unquote, wears down the forces of Russia. So we're just like sending people to be grist for the mill so that we like, quote unquote, militarily like weaken an adversary. Like that really fucks with your brain when you realize that like this is kind of how the geopolitical game is played. And I only bring that up not to drag this conversation into an area where it doesn't belong, but just to try to give listeners a sort of like other example that they can latch onto of like, if you're hearing the powers that be sort of frame the narrative for you about Korean unification, like maybe like pump the brakes for a second. And Ju-Hyun, I just wanted to sort of ask if you could like, if we could round this out after this incredible discussion, like just for regular working folks here who need to understand and need to cut through that sort of, bullshit that they're hearing from the media and politicians, like why, what would like the kind of reunification of Korea like actually mean in this situation? And like, how can folks, regular working folks like support that and support their fellow workers across the world in Korea?
Thanks for that question, Max. I see you've thrown me another softball.
Sorry, in 5 minutes or less.
All right. So to keep it very, very short, I think the thing to understand is that Korea was united for over 1,000 years. The Korean War occurred within living memory. The division of Korea occurred within living memory. It tore apart about 1 in 3 Korean families, which is probably a low estimate. So there are people alive today who have not seen their parents, haven't seen their children, haven't seen their siblings for pretty much their entire lives, for close to a century, who have no idea what happened to them. And this is just a reality for many and many of our people. And so this is a very personal thing when we talk about reunification. We're not talking about, some pie in the sky political idea. For many people, it just means I want to see my family again. I want to know what happened to my family. I want to see my home. I want to go home. So I think, that's the most human level at which I can communicate it. Politically, what it means is removing and finally ending this war. It means, it means across the peninsula really committing to the fact of a shared destiny, which is really inevitable. You can't pick up South Korea and put it in Ohio. You can't pick up North Korea and put it on the moon, right? We live on the same peninsula. And we have a shared destiny, as one country, because that's what Korea is. It is one country. It always has been. And the political question of how unification happens is a little bit more complicated. But what I can say is that it's something that Koreans have been thinking about for many, many generations. And even when there are differences in ideology and economic systems, there is a shared commitment and agreement, including from the government of the DPRK, from North Korea, to abide by a system wherein the the threat of war could be removed, the possibility of living together could once again come into the picture, and where it wouldn't necessarily be about imposing one system upon the other. It would really be about coming together again as a nation, coming together again to build a shared destiny through a democratic, gradual, generational process. So I think, this idea that reunification is somehow uniquely impossible, that the differences are just too great, that, once the DMZ comes down, then people will just begin slaughtering each other or something, is really just a narrative that entirely serves the United States, that entirely serves those interests that want to keep Korea divided. Now, when we get back to this question of what does solidarity look like? What can people do? I think one of the most important things actually is to unite the labor movement with the anti-war movement in this country. The United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. That is Dr. King's quote from over half a century ago. It is still true today. What we're seeing in Ukraine right now is a dress rehearsal for what interests in the Pentagon and on Wall Street ultimately want to do to China. And so Taiwan is a major flashpoint that, could become another Ukraine, but so is Korea. And when we talk about, these wars between these massive powers, these are not going to be small affairs. These are nuclear armed powers that would essentially fight a battlefield over most of the surface of the planet, right? China and the United States are connected by the Pacific Ocean. When the last time the United States went to direct war with a power that could be described as having the same level of military capabilities, which was Japan, that was a war that was essentially fought across all of Asia, across the entire Pacific. And I don't think that any kind of direct confrontation with China would be any different. And so I know that, oftentimes in the US, it can feel like, oh, well, we don't know enough about these situations abroad. It's confusing. There's always people trying to tell us, different things that we need to do. I think that even if you are confused personally, even if you feel like you don't know enough, what every person can know is that war is not good for the planet. War is not good for people. War is not good for workers. Who does war benefit? It benefits profiteers from war, and only profiteers from war. It benefits those who have a business interest or a political interest in advancing war. And those are not the working class. Those are not the workers of the US. So I think it is really essential to find ways to politicize the workers' movement in the US, because that is really the thing that is going to provide any kind of internal possible block from within the United States, in addition to other progressive movements that also exist here as well. And I think to just kind of end on a final note, a lot of what I'm talking about in terms of a confrontation in the Pacific is in motion. Next month, Yoon Suk-yeol is going to visit the United States. The president of South Korea is going to come here for a summit with Biden. And a lot of what this is all gearing towards is to build a new alliance between Japan, South Korea, and the United States. Japan was Korea's colonizer. For the last 70-odd years, there has been a conflict, even between South Korea and Japan, over this legacy, this colonial legacy. And what Yoon Suk-yeol is now trying to do is to put all these matters to rest in order to lay the path for South Korea to join more formal military alliances with both the US and Japan that feed into the project of encircling China. Now, the reason why this is important is because all the chess pieces are already moving, right? The US is already orchestrating many, many different maneuvers that are building its political and military capacity within East Asia. And the object is entirely for the purposes of confrontation with China that will come about in some form or another. This is something that to decision makers in Washington is not an if, but a when. And so I think workers in the U.S. and organizers in the U.S. also need to be looking at it that way, because if we're talking about this kind of cataclysmic confrontation, there is no way that that doesn't touch every single part of our lives. And I'm not just talking about for folks in the US, but I really mean the entire planet. And we know already that we are standing at the precipice and at a turning point, not just in history, but really for our species when it comes to the question of climate change, and now also with the question of nuclear war. And so I would really say that, it's all out right now. It's socialism or barbarism, it's extinction or survival. And even when things can feel complicated, when it can feel overwhelming, it really is essential to understand that there is no option to not pick a side. And it is really essential. It is really important for all movements in the U.S. That want to be working towards justice to be coming together, to be combating imperialism as the primary contradiction that we're facing today in the world, because it's only with a people's victory on that front that we're going to even be able to ensure our capacity to have much of a future anyway. So we're all in this together, or we're all going down with the ship.